Hello, welcome. It is November 5th, 2025, and we're in Active Inference GuestStream 123.1 with Marcelo Guzman, learning with physical networks. So Marcelo will give a presentation, and then I will read some questions from the live chat. So thank you for joining, to you for the presentation.
All right. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for the invitation. So I'm Marcelo Guzman. I'm a postdoc at the University of Pennsylvania, and today I want to talk about learning with physical networks. So one such example is the one that you're seeing to your left in your video. This is an electronic circuit. Okay, seems kind of complicated, but this electronic circuit has the property that's able to self-adapt. And by doing that, it can learn machine learning tasks like a computer, like an artificial neural network. The topic of my talk is going to be centered around two papers that appear this year. One is microscopic imprints of learned solutions in tunable networks. It's open source in PRX. And the other one is physical networks become what they learn, which is in physical review letters. And in a nutshell, what I want to tell you is how physics shapes the way these machines learn. All right. And hopefully by the end of this talk, you're going to understand this picture that is appearing to your right, and I'm going to explain it to you later. So let's begin with learning. So when we think about learning, we have these two big paradigms. Right now, we have this very trendy paradigm of machine learning. Okay. And on the other hand, we have our brain, or what happens in biology, what I call biological learning. And these two paradigms are very powerful, although they are very, very different. Okay, and so here I'm listing some of the differences that that are in between these two. For example, in artificial neural network, what you usually do is to modify the weight parameters. Current technologies, current large language models have around 10 to the 12 parameters. Everything is digital. Everything is happening in your computer or in digital centers. It's very energy demanding. Everything is centralized by CPUs or GPUs, and it lives in the virtual world. There is no physics. Okay. On the other hand, if you consider the brain, what you do with learning is you modify this synaptic strength. You have around 10 to the 14 synapses. Everything is analog, and from time to time you go to the digital domain. You have these spikes, very energy efficient. Okay, so to operate the brain, you just spend as much power as a light bulb. It's distributed. That is, you don't have any CPU or GPU, and it's subject to physical laws. So, but learning is a much broader phenomenon. Okay, and what I want to introduce now is a third paradigm that we call physical learning. So this is one example of a physical learning system. So this is a resistor network. Okay, so all the edges are resistors. This is the experimental realization, and what this resistor network does is to modify its own conductances. All right, and therefore by that learning machine learning task. It has around 10 to the 2 parameters. This is a very novel technology. It's completely analog, it's energy efficient, it's fast, it's distributed. And what I want to highlight is that it is also subject to physical laws. All right, you cannot circumvent those. So why do we want to study this kind of third paradigm? And there are two main reasons in the community. One reason, which is more on the engineering side, is to improve the current technologies of machine learning. Can we make artificial neural networks more energy efficient? Can we increase the speed? Can we make it more robust to damage? But there is also a fundamental part of it, and this is what I'm interested in, is that maybe by studying these kind of systems, we can understand some more complex biological phenomena. These physical learning systems are simpler than biology, and yet they are complex enough to display learning. All right. So let me begin by introducing a dictionary. So what is what in these learning physical networks? I am going to take as a starting point an artificial neural network. Okay, and I'm going to compare side by side with this learning resistor network. So the nodes in an artificial neural network are basically the neuron activations. In the resistor networks, these are going to be voltage nodes. The edges in an artificial neural network has the weight parameters. In the resistor network, it's going to contain the conductances of my edges. And the external inputs are fed as input data here, X in the artificial neural network, whereas in the resistor network, it's going to be fed as input current. All right. So how do we convert inputs to outputs? That is, what is the forward problem, or what is the input to output relation, and what is the inference problem? So in an artificial neural network, what you do is you take some inputs, you multiply them by a weight matrix, W1, for example, and then you apply a nonlinear transformation, let's say a sigmoid function. And then that result, you multiply it by the next matrix, weight matrix layer, and then you apply a final nonlinear transformation. So that's why you go from X to Y, the output. In the resistor network, what you do is you are going to apply the current, okay? And then you're going to let the system do its thing. Let physics work. That is the equilibration part. So currents are going to be reaccommodated in the network, etc., etc. You wait till it reaches the steady state, and you're going to select one of the nodes or a handful of the nodes, and you're going to read out the voltage that you obtain. And of course, the voltage is going to be a function of the conductances and the currents. So notably, this is where the key difference lies. This process of equilibration must obey physical laws. And for example, in a resistor network, there are two laws. One that is called the Kirchhoff's current law. That is, at every single node in this network, all the current in must equal the current out. And also, for every loop, the voltage across the loop must be zero. That's Kirchhoff's voltage law. So this is a physical constraint. No matter how your circuit is designed, you have to obey this. So inference in this problem is defined by physics. And now we have also the inverse problem, which is basically learning. So what you do in an artificial neural network is that you want to update the weights such that you decrease the cost. And the cost is basically a distance between the output Y and a desired output Y hat. In learning for resistor networks, you basically update the conductances K to decrease the distance between what you obtain as a voltage output and what your desired voltage output is. All right. And these networks are built in the lab. So here, what I'm showing you is an experimental learning resistor network built by my colleague Sam Dilavou at UPenn. Here, I'm highlighting in red one resistor. Okay. So this is one adaptive resistor, and each of these resistors is able to update its conductance value based on pure local information, just based on the voltages across its terminals. And it learns through a learning rule called coupled learning. So if you want to know more details about this experimental circuit, you can check these two references. Just for this presentation, I'm going to show you a video of a classification task performed by this machine. So this is a very simple task, but it's helpful for visualization. Basically, you have two axes here, the horizontal and the vertical axis representing inputs 1 and 2. All these data points are training data points, and the goal of this task is to place a decision boundary right in between these two classes of points. The background color is the prediction of the network at the very beginning of training. So it's basically everything is blue. But as training progresses, and this is experiments, the network is able to correctly place this decision boundary in a couple of seconds, okay? So these networks work. Now, what we have to understand here is that physical learning in this system is a double optimization problem. So let me explain this. For the forward problem, that is from input to output, we have this process of equilibration. And let me take the simplest kind of system we can consider, linear resistors. That is, you have to obey Ohm's law. That is basically the statement that the current at each edge is basically the conductance of the edge times the voltage drop of that edge. So if we consider that kind of system, Then equilibration is basically the minimization of the electrical power. That is, whatever you get as a physical response minimizes this power. And the electrical power is basically the energy per unit of time that you are consuming. So this mathematically is the sum over all the edges of the conductance times the voltage drop squared, such that the response is basically the minimizer of the power minus the input constraint. Geometrically, you can think about this power as a physical landscape, all right? As a physical landscape in a very high dimensional space of voltages. So here I just put a cartoon at the bottom. Each axis represents the voltage of one of the nodes. So for this picture, I have 4x4 nodes, that is 16 dimensions. And over this space, I'm going to define the power. And under the physical response, the voltage response is going to be the one that minimizes this one. So that's one minimization. Where's the second minimization? Well, the second minimization is learning itself. All right. To solve the inverse problem, you have to update the conductance to decrease the cost. And so you can see that learned solutions are the minima of this cost landscape. Now, notice that this is another landscape that lives in a completely different space, which is the space of parameters, the adaptive parameters, the space of conductances. And learned solutions are at the bottom of this landscape. Very, very well. So let me just zoom out a little bit. So this is the fundamental difference between an artificial neural network that only minimizes the cost and a learning resistor network that has to minimize the cost and the power. And so you may say, well, this seems like a more complicated problem. So instead of one minimization, you have to do two minimizations. But it turns out that the minimization of power is automatic. This is just nature doing its own thing. And I'm going to show you further that because of this double optimization problem, we can get some very nice results and intuition of the inner workings of learning in this resistor. All right. And also let me mention that this physical learning as a double optimization is very general. It is regardless of the architecture you use. You can use the grid network that my colleagues built in the lab, or you can use a completely disordered network. It is independent on the learning rule, whether you use gradient descent, a stochastic gradient descent, coupled learning, Hessian learning, it does not matter. And it's independent on the learning task, whether you use classification, regression, or you name it. So it's a property of these physical learning systems. So what are the consequences? What are the consequences of this double optimization problem? And to walk you through this talk, I want to introduce a very simple example, which is learning one data point. So some people may say, oh, but this is not learning, this is just fitting one data point. Maybe, but I think this is going to fix some ideas. It's going to be very intuitive. So consider the following. Consider a disordered resistor network of 300 nodes, like you see in the picture, and roughly 700 edges. And consider the following task. Imagine that I input current I such that at these nodes blue and red, the voltage is going to be fixed at 0 and 1. And the goal of the task is that very far away at these two nodes, I would like to have a precise voltage value of 0.99 and 0.01. All right. So let's say we begin with all the conductances being equal to 1. So here the conductances are colored. Here the edges are colored according to the conductance value. You can see that they are all 1. You apply the input current. You let the system equilibrate. And what happens is that the voltage response is going to minimize the power. All right. So here what you're seeing is the voltage value. All right. The voltage value of every single node in the background as the response of the system. You can see that where I input 0 and where I input 1, I have blue and red. But as you go far away from these two nodes, everything goes like in between to the gray area in which the voltage is 0.5. Let me give you a little bit of more detail to the forward problem. So I told you that the power is the sum of over the edges of the conductance times the voltage drop. Mathematically speaking, you can always write this down as a vector of voltages times a matrix H times the vector of voltages. This is a quadratic form. And this matrix H is what we know as the physical Hessian. All right, as a good Hessian is just the second derivative of the power with respect to the voltages. And this is where all the conductances get into play. So this H matrix depends on two matrices, delta and K. K is a diagonal matrix of all the conductances, and delta, it is known in network literature as the incidence matrix. So it's basically telling you the connectivity of your network. It is going to be 1 if an edge is connected to a node, if it is incoming, -1 if it is outgoing, and 0 if it is not connected. So the power can be written in terms of the Hessian, of the physical Hessian, and therefore the response of the system, it can be written in terms of the physical Hessian. It is the inverse of the physical Hessian times the input current. So that's exactly how you get the voltage response of the system. And then once you get the voltage response, you measure at these two nodes of interest, and you see what you obtain. So here, this measurement, I put it in terms of a projector, meaning that out of all the voltages that I obtain from my response, I will only project into the two voltages of interest, two nodes of interest. And what you get according to this color bar scale is that everything is roughly 0.501. All right. But this is not what we wanted. What we wanted was like a voltage output very precise of 0.99 and 0.01. So what you have to do is to modify all the conductances to begin with. All right. So I'm not going to consider a specific learning rule, but I'm going to show you one possible result, solution to this problem. In particular, I obtained this result by using coupled learning on simulations. But this is a possible solution, which is kind of interesting. So you can see that to the left, the network developed a crack, a line of very, very low conductances, as you can see by the color. This line is basically separating the system into two sides. One side that remains with very high voltage in the voltage response, in red, the other side with very low voltage, and in such a way that the output nodes are just on one side of the other of this crack, and therefore achieving this function. All right. So at the end of training, whether for this task or another task, what happens is that you are at the minima of two different landscapes in two different spaces. Minima of the power, one minimum of the power, one minimum in the cost. So what can we learn about these two minima? And what I want to do now is to give you some geometric intuition of these high dimensional landscapes. So first, a geometric picture of the cost landscape around a minimum. So imagine you're at a minimum of the cost. Okay. Now what I can do is to tailor expand this cost. The zeroth term is going to be a constant, which is the cost that you obtain at that minimum. The first order contribution is going to be the gradient, but since we're at a minimum, that gradient is 0. And therefore, the next non-negligible contribution comes from this second order term, which is k minus the solution k times a matrix H, which is also a Hessian, although a different Hessian, times k minus k solution. And this calligraphic H is what we call the cost Hessian. That is the second derivative of the cost with respect to the parameters evaluated at the solution. And since we are at the minimum, this is a symmetric and positive semi-definite matrix. And it has a very nice geometric interpretation. The eigenvalues of this matrix are the curvatures in these high-dimensional landscapes along directions defined by the eigenvectors. So let's take the previous example. So we found this learned solution. Let's compute the cost Hessian spectrum evaluated the solution. And what we find is the following. So here what you're seeing are all the eigenvalues. You have as many eigenvalues as edges in your network, so around 700. This is a log scale. And you can see that out of the 700 eigenvalues, 699 are extremely close to zero, are very, very small. So what that means is that you are in this very high dimensional space, and in 699 directions, the landscape looks flat. And there's one direction. There's one eigenvalue that is way larger than the next eigenvalue by 7 orders of magnitudes. That is, in this high dimensional space, there is one direction in which the curvature is just huge, it's gigantic. All right. Meaning if you move along this direction, you can think about this as the Great Canyon, rim to rim. You take a step into this direction and you climb up the cost by a lot. All right. By the way, this phenomenon is also observed in deep learning. So this is a property of learning in general. Okay, you have a few stiff eigenmodes. So what is this direction? What is this direction in which the curvature is extremely huge? That's what we call the stiff eigenvector, the stiff cost eigenvector. So remember that this stiff eigenvector lives in conductance space. So I can assign each entry of this eigenvector to its corresponding edge. And here I'm plotting the eigenvector over the graph. You can see that most of the entries are zero or yellow, except for this crack. Along this crack, the entries are huge, meaning that if you perturb any of these edges in black, you're going to basically climb up the cost and you're going to destroy the function. And this is a very sensitive, it makes total sense, because if you look at the solution itself, the solution is a crack of low conductances. If you were to increase any conductance along this crack, you're basically going to short circuit your network, or you're going to lose the function. So the take-home message here is that the large entries of these stiff cost eigenvectors are the key components for your learned solution. And what we did with my colleagues was to basically relate the geometry of this cost landscape to the geometry of the physical landscape. So we observed the following. So I told you that the cost Hessian describes the curvature around the learned minimum in conductance space. In the same sense, the physical Hessian describes the curvature of the physical landscape, the power, in voltage space. And what we observe is that the stiff cost eigenvector, the direction in which the curvature is the largest, matches very well the soft physical eigenvector. That is the direction of my physical landscape in which the curvature, along which the curvature is the smallest. All right. So you can see that here, this crack in which the edges are in black are basically the lines separating the red from the blue region. Not only that, but we run over 2,000 simulations of different networks with different initial conditions. And when we plot the cost eigenvalue, the stiff cost eigenvalue, with the softest physical eigenvalue, we have this neat power law, power to the -4. And so this was a first suggestion. And this first suggestion was that it is possible to know the function from pure physical information. That is, you handle me a network, I can measure the Hessian. This is a physical property of the network, which is regardless of training data, regardless of a task. I can measure the Hessian. And by measuring the Hessian, the physical Hessian, I get information about the cost landscape, about what it was trained for. So, we got very excited, and we call this paper "Physical Networks Become What They Learn," because at the end of the day, you train the network, and everything gets imprinted into the physical landscape, and we can measure that physical landscape. So these are just a few properties that I'm highlighting here. We also studied the dynamics of learning, but I'm not going to touch on that subject today. But all right, let's continue. So we had this relation between stiff cost eigenvectors, soft physical eigenvectors, But it turns out that the relation is much more complex when you have more than one data point. Okay, so everything I showed you was for specific example of one data point, but learning is about more data points, right? And we realized that stiff cost eigenvectors are not simply the soft physical eigenvectors, but there is still a relation. And just to give you a simple example in which the relation is more complicated, consider this network here. You have two sources in red, two inputs in red, and two outputs in blue. And this network was trained to perform a linear regression. That is, I want the voltages at the output to be a linear function of my voltages at the input with precise, very precise coefficients. Okay, so the network was trained in silico and it found a solution. And for these cases, for example, the simple relation between stiff eigenvectors and soft eigenvectors does not hold anymore. You can also consider more complicated tasks in which you have to classify data into three classes. And so these are two examples of systems which are more complicated and we needed to understand. And so we have to dig deeper. And this is the context of the second paper, Microscopic Imprints of Learned Solutions in Tunable Networks. I'm going to spare you all the tedious math, and I'm going to give you just the high-level results. But at the end of the day, we demonstrated mathematically and confirmed numerically that for any double optimization problem, physical learning, you have a structure function. We can find a structure function relations. And this is what I mean by that. We show that the cost Hessian at the end of learning decomposes into two parts. One that's pure training and the other one that's pure physics. To be more precise, so if I write down the ij component of the cost Hessian, I can write it down as the contraction of two tensors, two high-order tensors, tensor L and tensor S. To avoid all the index notation, I'm going to just write this as 4 dots in here. So what is L? L is what we call the training tensor, all right? So let's consider I have R data points. The L tensor is going to be the sum over all the data points of the projector Q times the input data I, times the projector Q times the input data I. So this funny symbol here is just an outer product symbol. And you can see that this doesn't contain any physics. It's just input data. Okay, this is the information you train your network on. And on the other side, you have what we call the tuning susceptibility tensor. This is also a higher order tensor. It's the outer product of the same vector 4 times. And this vector is what we call the susceptibility vector. Here is where the physical Hessian appears, the inverse of the physical Hessian. And this, again, is only physical information, all right? So where's the function and where's the structure? I told you, structure-function relation. Well, the function is encoded into the Hessian, into the cost Hessian, by this geometric picture. And the structure is encoded into the tuning susceptibility. This is all the information of the network, the connectivity and the conductances. You can even go to a deeper level and show the same relation, not only at the level of the Hessians, but at the level of the stiff cost eigenvectors. So you can show that the stiff directions that I show you in these landscapes can be written down in terms of this susceptibility, the normative susceptibility and the unit vector susceptibility. And this matrix A is basically what contains the learning information, would be the analog of the matrix L in here. So next question is, well, what is this susceptibility and how much information it contains about the function? So I told you susceptibility is the outer product of the same vector 4 times. You can see it 4 times. That means that the physical Hessian inverse appears 4 times. And that's basically what explained the previous observation, that the scaling relation is power to the -4. The susceptibility is also a physical observable. It's a physical property. In fact, Si alpha, that is the alpha entry of Si, is the voltage drop at Hi due to a unit current at node alpha. Here I'm showing you one example. Here I'm showing you, I'm plotting the susceptibility of this green edge. So that is the voltage drop at this green edge when I supply currents, at different node locations. You can see that near the edge, the susceptibility is large, but as you go far away, the susceptibility is very low. And for each edge, you can compute its total susceptibility, and you can plot it over the graph. And what you see is the structure emerging. So, let me show you what we can do with this. So consider the 2x2 regression example that I showed you before. Let me show you the cost landscape picture. Before training, before everything, the cost eigenvalues are just distributed all over the place. But after training, the cost eigenvalues become degenerate. Almost all eigenvalues are close to zero. And in this case, you have four stiff eigendirections, four stiff eigenvalues. These are the four stiff eigenvectors. Okay. And what we obtain from the physical landscape, that is, I only measure the susceptibility, is a pattern that resembles a lot the stiff eigenvector. In fact, if you compare them one to one, here I have four different colors indicating the four different eigenvectors. You can see that large susceptibilities, that is, edges with large Si, correspond to edges with large entries of eigenvectors. So the large susceptibilities reveal the key components. Okay, and this is for one example, but you can do it for 2x5 regressions. And once again, large susceptibilities correspond to the large entries. You can do it for classification tasks. And in all these cases, you observe the same trend. All right. Now, notice that this is not perfect because I don't have the complete information. This is what we can infer by doing physical measurements. And then we also run a lot of simulations and we observe a lot of properties. For example, we observe that across all our systems, highly susceptible edges tend to block current. So here to the left, what you're seeing, what you're looking at is the susceptibility. So white means low susceptibility, black means large susceptibility of a train network. And when you compare these large susceptibility edges, which are highlighted in green, and you compare it to the current that it flows through them, you can see that high susceptibility corresponds to very, very low current. All right. So here to the right, what you're seeing is a vector field plot. The direction of the arrow indicates the direction of the current. The magnitude of the current is in color from white to black, and precisely in the same regions, in the same green regions, you see zero current. We also observed that the susceptibility is dominated by soft physical modes. So here in the y-axis, forget this notation, in the y-axis, what I'm plotting is the susceptibility computed with the first n physical modes over the susceptibility computed with all the modes. So you can see that by considering only a handful of modes, I quickly reach one, right? Meaning that susceptibility is governed by these soft modes. And so in summary, what we have is the following. We have that learning in these resistor networks is a double optimization process, all right? Minimization of power and minimization of cost. We showed that in these two papers that because of this double optimization process, we have a general structure function relation. We can measure the key components from the most susceptible edges. And that's the picture that you are seeing here. This error mode is basically the stiff cost eigenvector. And on the other side, you obtain what you measure from the tuning susceptibility. And these are the two sides of one coin. And we have basically a new tool to study and interpret learned solutions in physical networks. So everything I told you was in the context of linear resistor networks, but it turns out that this is way more general. So in fact, this is applicable to any system with a double optimization. It is applicable to any continuum nonlinear system. What we did at the end of the day was tailor expand around the minima of two different landscapes. And one such example are mechanical networks. So mechanical networks minimize energy. You have an elastic network, it has its physical response minimizes energy. or free energy if you're adding temperature. And you can tune the network, you can tune the stiffness, you can tune the rest length, and you can tune the network to perform a desired behavior. In fact, nonlinear elastic networks, even though you have Hookean springs, can be nonlinear in the energy. Here, just to give you the translation, the dictionary, the nodes are displacements, the edges contain stiffness, and the extra inputs are the input forces. So this is also a kind of system in which you can apply this formalism of physical learning. And you can even go beyond what is actually considered learning. So consider, for example, protein allostery. So I'm going to show you that protein allostery can be seen as a double optimization process. So what is protein allostery? Consider a protein here, in green. A regulatory molecule comes to bind to the protein. That binding induces a long-range deformation that then allows a ligand to an extra molecule to couple to it. All right. So in order for this conformational deformation to be useful, you need to have the right set of parameters. This is a very precise deformation. And evolution, once has minimized the error, or has maximized the fitness in terms of these parameters. Now, the parameters can be the sequence of amino acids or the DNA sequence. So this is one optimization problem, just evolution. But physics obliges you to minimize the free energy as a function of deformations. So once again, double optimization. And it turns out that proteins are studied as elastic network models today. So the question is, can the susceptibility predict the most important amino acids for allosteric, the most important parameters? And this is a problem that I would say, in a more canonical sense, it's not considered learning, but it turns out that you can frame it as a learning problem. All right. So this is my last slide. Let's zoom out a little bit. Everything I told you was about physical constraints. Everything I told you came from the fact that these systems minimize power or energy in addition to minimizing the cost. This is only one type of physical constraint. There are many, many others. For example, when you actually build the systems, these are analog systems. You try to build the system, you try to build it as neat and cleanly as possible. But inevitably, you have imperfect components. That's a reality of our physical world. You have imperfect components. It turns out that when you learn with these imperfect components, you get some very interesting behavior. We get that our learning rules are being modified. If you want to know more about this, we have this archive paper on understanding and embracing imperfection in physical learning networks, in which we show how these physical imperfections, like unexpected bias, can impact the learning dynamics of these systems. When you have power and energy minimization, and you couple that with noise and nonlinearities, you can actually devise out of electric circuits restricted pulse machines of very similar behavior as the restricted pulse machines. And with that, you can have unsupervised and probabilistic learning with contrastive local learning networks. So that's the name of these networks, contrastive local learning networks. You can also check that out on the archive. And also, another property of real systems is that they have limited sensitivity. That is, they cannot respond to any tiny, minute gradient. All right. It turns out that if you consider this ingredient into these physical networks that in addition take space, take real space, this limited sensitivity can be beneficial and can help overcome what's known in the literature as catastrophic forgetting. This is soon going to be on the archive, so stay tuned. And with that, let me thank you, my collaborators that took part on these two papers, Felipe Martins, Nahi Stern, Vijay Balasubramanian, and Andrea Liu, who is in the chat now. And also thank my funding sources. And let me take any questions you may have. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. People can write any questions in the live chat. Andrea, would you like to give any comments or any questions?
Well, maybe just to say, I mean, Marcelo, I'm sorry I had to miss the beginning because I was teaching, but
Mhm.
and probably Marcelo made this point, but I think it can't be made strongly enough that you know, when when you use physical networks to learn things, of course there are disadvantages compared to neural networks on the computer, but there are also really significant advantages. um, you know, and that in addition to practical advantages, for example, a lower energy consumption and stuff like that, I think um, the there's a huge advantage in terms of our ability to understand the nature of the solutions. Um,
Mhm.
and this because we have this double optimization process and we can just look at the physical aspects and they tell us so much. It gives us a really nice handle into how the system is learning things, the kind of solutions the system learns.
Mhm.
Cool. All right, I will read some questions from the live chat and some questions that I wrote down. So, first question from Bert. Very clear presentation. Question: how do you experimentally measure the susceptibility in a real electrical network?
Oh, yeah. Uh, Let me go back here. So let's say you want to measure the susceptibility of the green edge here. What you basically want to do is to apply a unit current at a given node, and by measuring the voltage drop of the green edge due to the unit current at this voltage node, you are going to measure the susceptibility. That's the physical interpretation. And so, and so, yes. So here, what I'm plotting are several measurements. So for each node, I'm plotting the voltage drop of the green edge due to a unit current there. So here I'm representing as many measurements as number of nodes. So that's one way of measuring. Then there is the second way of measuring, which is by adding some noise to the system and just measuring the the behavior of your noisy dynamics. From that, you can also infer the information of the susceptibility. And maybe that's a more like a meaningful way of measuring instead of doing one by one, because then you have to do it for every single edge one by one. But that's basically it. It's a measure of voltage drop due to unit currents at different nodes.
Why does the inverse Hessian appear 4 times?
Yeah. This has to do with the mathematical derivation. Uh, Let me see if I can find um, oh, yes. So, well, it's part of the mathematical formulation. So basically, here's the thing. Let me go here. Okay. This is I want you to focus. Can you see my mouse? Yes. Okay. Here, you can see that the physical response is the physical Hessian inverse times the input current. So that's one physical Hessian. Now, how do you measure the error? The error usually is the response minus what you want squared. Okay. So when you measure the gradient, what you will have to take the derivative of this quantity with respect to k. That is the derivative of the inverse of the physical Hessian. But when you take the Hessian, the cos Hessian, what will appear is the derivative of the inverse of the physical Hessian to the power of 2. Turns out that the derivative of the inverse of the physical Hessian is basically the physical Hessian multiplies twice. And so when you do all the math, you will realize that naturally the physical Hessian inverse is going to appear 4 times. Okay. And by the way, I think I didn't argue why we call it susceptibility. All right. And we call it susceptibility for a very important reason. It's because the quantity here, S, I wrote basically the final expression of this mathematical derivation, but the initial expression of this mathematical derivation is that S is basically the derivative of the physical Hessian with respect to the conductances. And basically what it's telling you that this is measuring how much your response is going to change when you change a little bit the conductances. So it's literally a notion of susceptibility. How susceptible is your response when you tweak certain conductances? And it turns out that the end result of that is these 4 vectors that appear in here.
Thank you.
I think maybe it's a little bit easier to understand not why there are 4 powers, but why stiff modes of the cos Hessian are related to soft modes of the physical Hessian, right? If you go back to, yeah, exactly. Yeah, you want to explain that, Marcelo?
Sure.
That
yes.
picture.
Yeah. So I guess what you have in mind is that the softest modes are the easiest to excite.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So we found this stiffest cost eigenvector in the cost landscape. All right, in this very high dimensional cost landscape. These are the most important parameters. And so what's the meaning of these soft physical eigenvectors? Turns out that your physical response, you can decompose it as a linear combination of all the physical eigenvectors. All right. And the magnitude of the eigenvalue indicates how easy it is to activate those eigenvectors. And basically what this is telling me is that the network learns by virtue of the easiest to actuate mode. So it doesn't have to activate the last mode, which is the most energetic one. It doesn't have to activate the next one or the next one. It just simply activates the easiest mode, the one with the softest or the smallest physical eigenvalue. And that's how these networks learn. They learn by softening in the right ways, by becoming basically what they actually learn.
Very cool. Yeah, like a physical object shaking. The softest thing is going to start vibrating first, or the weakest link in the chain is going to break. Otherwise, it would have been a different chain. And then it's the stiff cost, and these visualizations make it really clear, though there's clearly a lot of math with it too, that stiff cost is in the gap between the 2 soft parts. So it's kind of like a cake that got with a cut, or with a hard chocolate or something, like separating 2 parts that have different resonant modes. And then I think the protein allostery makes it clear as well. Like if a ligand bound in an amino acid didn't move, that non-movement couldn't be a difference for making a difference for allostery, because it wouldn't be responsive. Whereas something that binds to low concentration, or moves a lot with another ligand binding, it's gonna start like a rising tide with the susceptibilities in a ranked way, depending on the modulator.
Yeah, and this is you're correct, and this is surprising. This is surprising because there are many solutions. There are many configurations that could lead to solving this problem. This is only one of them. And what we find is that through these learning rules, okay, we seem to systematically find this kind of solutions in which you soften, you actually work by the softest mode. And that's fascinating, but doesn't have to be the case, right? You could make a contrived example in which you function because of the hardest mode of your physical Hessian, but that does not appear. In any case, but what's beautiful also is that no matter how it works, this relation holds. No matter whether you work by your softened mode, which is what we actually observe, or you work by a very contrived way of working, this relation stays the same. This is a very general mathematical framework for these double optimization problems.
Okay, thank you. A lot of other questions. I'll read one from live chat. So Tucker wrote, will science build effective proteomic computers using allosteric input-output? Or maybe a kind of more general variant of that I think arises and you touch upon is what kinds of computational or cognitive systems could be designed with a better grasp of what you're researching?
That's a very speculative question. I don't know how to answer that. I think the value of this kind of research is that we can actually understand how they work, how they learn, what type of solutions we're getting at. I don't know yet where this could lead us. I mean, that's why we are doing research in the first place. But Andrea, I don't know if you want to add something to this question.
Just to say that probably not for proteins, because they're just not big enough to be highly overparameterized to do really complex tasks. So the number of tunable parameters that you have in a protein, well, you have a choice of 20 amino acids at each site in the sequence. So it's determined by the length of the protein. And this is why proteins can be multifunctional. They can have more than one function, but they tend not to have more than, most of them have basically one, and some have a few. There are just not very many that can solve very complex tasks. So I think the answer for proteins is really no, because they also have to fold into their structure. For the circuits, can these ideas help us make better circuits? Yeah, I think so, because one of the things it says is that, okay, well, if you have an imperfect circuit, you don't want to tend to have very many high susceptibility edges where it really depends on that edge doing the right thing. And so, low susceptibility solutions might be more robust and to these sorts of imperfections. And so then this gives a way of perhaps training for lower susceptibility solutions.
As a biologist, that's really fascinating about enzymes because they have many constraints that they function and evolve under, many cellular constraints and protein production kinds that aren't necessarily related to their enzymatic function, and they do have a lot of allosteric and all this kinds of incredible structural events. However, those are like many fingers on the scale of usually several, but kind of a core activity. Even if it's a transcription factor activity or some epigenomic functionality that still can have very complex causal role, but it comes down to kind of like a train on a track, accelerating or decelerating or increasing or decreasing within kind of one constrained mode of action, which may be a solution to the evolvability. So then that leads me to ask, like, the physical device you were simulating, what are the like the kind of RAM, CPU, GPU analogies. Like, does different or improved functionality in the regression task come from more nodes? Is it important to build those systems to have different connectivity patterns? Or like what physical parameters relate to their ability to perform that regression? Or how large of a regression could the object that you were working with do?
Yeah, all right. That's a very good question. I mean, there are several aspects to this question, like the question of the architecture, for example. What is the best architecture for the circuits? I showed you that. I showed you this picture of the square grid, which is basically what my colleague built in the lab. Then I worked out the example of a disorder network. Short answer is that in general, like for the most general case, I don't think there is a clear understanding of what the best architecture should be. And it's the same problem in artificial neural networks. All right.
Well, actually, for
That being
linear,
said, for simple networks, like linear resistive networks, the ones that we have actually discussed today, there is the best architecture. And the best architecture turns out to be a crossbar array. That is, all the inputs connected to all the outputs. That's it, with all wires. That's the best you can do in a linear resistive network. And that's also that's a starting point to start understanding what the best architectures are. Also, we have some general properties that we share with artificial neural networks, meaning that the more parameters that you have when you are nonlinear, the better you are at learning. Okay, that gives you expressivity. If you can just tune more knobs, that's better. But also, it comes at a price, and the price you have to pay, well, your system is larger. Learning takes longer. You have to spend more energy. So there are this series of trade-offs that we have in these physical learning systems, and that we are currently investigating.
Yeah, very interesting. It reminds me of the physical and thermal, energetic, or other sources of energy. It's striking that they have that formal relationship to artificial neural networks that you just mentioned. Having a more, if compute were free, having more parameters, barring secondary issues, learns better. Or at least in certain ways. But then as soon as you start taking different constraints into effect, then that's why there is no best model size. Just even evidenced narrowly by the different numbers of parameters in generative AI families, because they kind of cover that spectrum, allowing you to say, if you have this much compute, you need this done at this speed, this is the computing cost. Whereas if you have a wired up physical system, it's using the constraints or just the unfolding of physical systems in this kind of like free compute mode. So do they take longer to equilibrate, or does it just get into questions of like having a laboratory or that can measure it? Or
No. I think if anything, the advantage of having these physical systems is that it equilibrates like this. This is an electronic circuit. It is extremely fast. I think what is a pity is that for us, the theorists, it's extremely hard to model when this circuit gets a little bit more complicated. So, but it's just I think it's a complication for us, people doing research on these systems. But the actual physical system equilibrates very quickly. It's very fast and very energy efficient when you compare it to a computer, for example. There's one point that I didn't discuss much, which is the topic of learning roles, because everything I told you was regardless of learning role. But the main advantage of this of this kind of object here, this experimental object, is that all the learning rules are local. That is, if you want to update this resistor, you only need to know the state of that resistor and nothing else. Whereas if you compare this to gradient descent on artificial neural networks, each parameter, each edge on your artificial neural network needs to know all the other states of edges in your network. So you have this gathering of information, okay, that you have to gather at the CPU level and then do the computations and then transfer back to all the edges. That costs a lot of energy. But here, everything is decentralized. It's a distributed network. And that's a lot of saving, even when you scale up.
Yeah, a few comments on that. That is sometimes a point that the biomimetic or neuromorphic computing communities also discuss, or like the NGC Learn biological learning package of Professor Rorbia. And then also, this is more on the computational side. It's something that software packages like RxInfer, or ultimately just like the graphical models that we're exploring in active inference, where there can be node local computation of local message passing and update rules. And that constraint for having a procedure that can be locally performed kind of prevents the need for the moving around of information that abstract kind of Turing von Neumann
Yep.
like server farm with infinite resources metaphor, like Turing tape with infinite space metaphor kind of has. And then another, I think, really striking point to explore is that when it well, first you mentioned free energy, so maybe you could give a comment on that. But the way that planning works in active inference agents in discrete or in continuous time, and in discrete time it's sort of a chess algorithm like tree search with secondary branching or secondary evaluations, but kind of like deep policy search in that machine learning tradition. But then in the continuous time planning setting, it's a Taylor expansion. And so then that allows for these different generalized coordinates, different orders or degrees of expansion of a Taylor approximation. And then that connects to like hierarchical Bayesian modeling with a Taylor series expansion. So maybe could you make any other points on the Taylor series or the free energy and the temperature?
Sure. Yeah.
Just a quick comment, basically, on your thing about the von Neumann bottleneck. Yeah, so people talk about in-memory compute, and our systems are definitely that because the memory is in the resistances, in the state of the tunable resistors, which is where the computation is done, right? But this is also because they're self-tuning by the local rule. It's also in-memory learning. Okay. The tuning is occurring on exactly the objects that are carrying the memory, which is the tunable resistors.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Go back to the.
Yeah. So a comment on the Taylor expansion. Yes. So the talk, I explicitly used linear resistor networks. That doesn't have to be the case, just for simplicity. But basically, what you want are two landscapes. I mean, that's the general description of these physical learning systems. And around the minimum of these two landscapes, you perform this Taylor expansion. All right. And what we are connecting is this second order description of these two landscapes in different spaces, the cost Hessian and the physical Hessian. Now, during this talk, I use power as the physical landscape. It doesn't have to be power. It could be energy and it could be free energy. All right. It has to be or it can be any Lyapunov function to be fair. All right. So you have a system that minimizes a Lyapunov function, a physical by its own physical dynamics, and then you want, in addition, to tune the parameters such that you minimize a cost. You have that setup, and then you can apply all of this reasoning. All right, and those are the only conditions. Two landscapes, you minimize or maximize these landscapes, and you want your system to be continuous, meaning that the parameters and to have this description, the parameters and the physical degrees of freedom, like the voltages or the positions of your bits, have to be continuous. And as soon as you have that, you have all these results for free. All for free. You have to do some math, but
Yeah.
but that's it.
Thank you. I'll ask another question from the live chat. Bert wrote, in mobility, corridors and barriers are varied. For example, a navigable river by boat or car. Could you capture something like travel modes?
Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
In mobility, like in a civic engineering or just physical mobility, corridors and barriers are varied. For example, a navigable river by boat or car. The river's navigable by the boat, not by car. Could you capture something like travel modes?
I think that we could capture, we can capture with this formalism these travel modes. For these systems, these are stationary systems that reach steady state. That's a fixed point, okay? But we are currently investigating the case in which the steady state, the response is not a fixed point, but could be a limit cycle. So the system in time, the response in time is changing. And if you do that, we think that if you do this Taylor approximation of the Lyapunov function that you are actually minimizing, then you will obtain the same kind of behavior in which you link the properties of the cos Hessian and the properties of the Hessian of this Lyapunov function.
Thank you for that comment. It reminds me a lot of the Lyapunov exponent's role in chaotic systems and complex systems and determining divergences. It's again a similar nexus with like a laminar flow, and then what are the disturbabilities, and then is that steady state just one static approximation, or does that steady state have these limit cycle or other kinds of chaotic properties?
I think so for the circuits in question, I don't think we have observed chaotic properties. I think what we can do are fixed points or limit cycles.
Well, we can tune now more general behaviors.
Okay.
Yeah, we could tune. I mean, we can use local rules now to tune limit cycles or whatever kind of dynamical behavior you want to build in. And the nice thing is that these ideas can be generalized. This what Marcelo talked about was all for reciprocal interactions, but the ideas can be generalized for non-reciprocal interactions too.
So maybe kind of a research practical question, like what software or methods do you use to design those problems, and how do you set out to when you're making it, other than for research explorations, like how would somebody adapt these methods to a given functionality or computation they were thinking of or wanting to model?
So on the experimental side, I don't think I can talk that much. I think those Sam is building the experiments. I can tell you on the theory side, we have. I mean, if people want to play with this kind of codes, they are fully available. All right, to simulate the learning of these physical systems. There are some GitHub repositories. You can look at the two papers. This open source paper, Microscopic Inference of Learned Solutions with Tunable Networks, has a link to a public GitHub repository in which you can play with simulating these networks. You can train them to do different things. You can train them to recognize images, do MNIST. We also have let's see. a more powerful tool now. So this is a project I didn't have the time to talk about, which is the third project, noise and nonlinearities, in which we basically endowed these resistor networks, these linear resistor networks, with noise and nonlinearities, and we devised what we call a restricted Kirchhoff machine. And these are unsupervised and probabilistic models. These networks that you can simulate, and again, you can look at the paper and you will find the GitHub repository public. You can simulate the circuits learning unsupervised tasks, learning to learning the distribution that gets from some input data. So if people are interested, those are the things. And at the level of the more engineering level, there are simulations today about all the actual circuit components. I think the software is called SPICE. You can simulate all these kind of learning networks. It's smaller than the effective modeling that we have in our public repositories, but it's also a play where you can actually simulate this. At the end of the day, there's no black magic in here. It's just electronic components.
Cool. Any other comments or anything else you want to share?
Andrea, maybe?
Well, maybe just since you're interested in the biological thing, and somebody asked about proteins. There's another postdoc in my group, Farshid Mohammed Rafieh, who is looking at global epistasis in proteins. So the idea is that, epistasis was where you do mutation A, do mutation B, and if you do both of them, what you get is not, the effect on the function is not the same as if you did them each separately and then added them together. And in global epistasis, these things are correlated globally, the non-additivity of the mutations. What we think this is coming from is from being over-parameterized. And so the nice thing about what the susceptibility analysis gives you is that it gives you a way of finding out what are the key amino acids that you don't want to mess with if you want to maintain function. Those are the key edges that Marcelo is talking about, without doing things like deep mutational scans and stuff like that. You can get it just from the physical properties of the protein itself.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. What's very fascinating about that is I'm thinking about a protein physical epistasis or allostery case with like physically transferred vibrational on molecule modes. Then I'm thinking about other multi-omics data sets like gene expression and genome variation for like a GWAS. So in both of those, we might make networks that have additivity, like super or sublinear additivity, aka epistasis. So we have statistical epistasis in quantitative genetics, GWAS, gene expression. So just, again, it's that striking parallel that there's a similar susceptibility framework for thinking about the abstract, quote, non-physical, like a GWAS or a co-expression network, the two loci being co-expressed up and down across tissues, it doesn't mean that they physically interact or that changing one changes the other. So there's all these different networks, and then by overlaying them, it'd be like, okay, so what transcript levels, or there could be things that would be biologically relevant with the transcript level could be very sensitive to phenotype or not, and they all kind of project down to the biological system being what it is, with a phenotype as that kind of single register for all of those statistical susceptibilities. So single omic analyses can tell part of the story. But then they're only part of the susceptibility. And then some of that would get revealed by single molecule protein. Other epistases don't get revealed at that scale. So it's like it brings a lot of unity to how those different data sets, even the past ones that were single omic, still have some degrees of variability reflected, but it was just one experiment, so it didn't pin down every axis of variability.
Right. But this is where the susceptibility analysis could be really useful.
Cool. Any last comments, Marcelo, or what are your next research/physical steps?
Yeah, all right. I'm very biased. I always say this, but I find this topic fascinating because I truly think that this could be a very tool and framework to understand more biological systems. My next steps career-wise, I'm moving to the ENS in Paris. I want to continue doing research on physical learning, also moving a little bit closer to biological systems. And just, I think there is a lot of things to do about how physical constraints actually shape the learning of real systems embedded in the real world, unlike virtual systems, but in which you're free to do anything you want. Here we have rules, we have constraints. How do these constraints affect the learning of actual physical systems and biological systems? I think these are just fundamental questions, and now likely physicists are just turning their attention to this kind of problems. So that's it. I encourage a lot of people doing this, like reading this kind of papers and just contacting us because I think this is truly fascinating.
Awesome. Andrea, any last comment? All right. Thank you both. Good luck with your research. Bye.
Right. All right. Thank you, Daniel.
Yeah.
It does, right?